Welcome to the Doctor's Kitchen podcast, where we discuss the most important aspects of food and lifestyle and how that relates to our health. Today I have a very special guest. Her name is Professor Felice Jacka, and she is the director of the Institute for Food and Mood in Australia, and she's just written a fantastic book that we're going to be talking about today called Brain Changer. She is an advocate for food as a potential intervention alongside other treatments for mental illness, and she's done some fabulous research, including the SMILES trial, which we'll be talking about today on the podcast. I'm going to be cooking a modified version of one of her recipes from her new book, and I know you're going to love this chat. Now, you're the author of a fantastic new book. I've read it cover to cover, as you can tell, because, I mean, there's,
so you're not making it up?
No, I'm not making it up. Brain Changer. Tell us about it.
Okay, so, well, starting with my PhD back in 2010, I guess I pioneered this field of research that we call nutritional psychiatry, and it focuses on the link between diet, nutrition and mental and brain health, and it looks at how we might prevent these mental illnesses and brain disorders, but also treat them using nutritional approaches. And I was asked many years ago to write a book, and I said no, we have to wait until we've got the data from the trials to say if we change diet we can change depression, because once we've got that, we've got the whole picture, and then we can give people advice. So when we published the SMILES trial in 2017, that sort of circle was finished, if you like. I'd done the work in from pregnancy to early childhood, adolescence, adults, older age, and then the trial, and I went, right, it's time for the book. And the other reason too is that people keep on asking for information, and you know, it needed to be something that was accessible, that people could understand readily.
I remember you actually writing that anecdote in the section on the SMILES trial, because I thought that was very, very admirable of you to not write a book, even though the offer was there, until you'd actually done the intervention trial.
That's right. You need it, and that's, I think, the key. The fundamental is that I really care about rigorous science. And there's so much misinformation out there. There's so many diet gurus, particularly in the US, who are promulgating, I think, quite often misinformation and information that's not evidence-based, or the evidence is very cherry-picked.
Before we talk anymore, I'm going to tell you what we're going to be cooking.
Okay.
It's going to be a modified version of one of the recipes in your book.
Cool.
It's the open Mediterranean sandwich. So we've got some beautiful sourdough that you all love the look of.
Really want to eat that.
And this is kind of the thing that you all eat like for lunch, right? So quite
absolutely.
light and
And our whole team, you know, we had the Food and Mood Centre. And we sit and have lunch together almost every day on a big table, and we all just inspect everybody else's food and go, oh my goodness, that looks amazing, can I have some of that? It's you know, always looks like this.
It sounds like I definitely need to pay a visit.
Yes, please do.
That's definitely the kind of place that I would love to work in. So we're going to be making a modified version of that Mediterranean open sandwich. So we're going to do some red onions, some beautiful local mushrooms that we've got here, some shiitake, we've got some Lincolnshire, I think. Some portobello mushrooms, so that's going to be like sort of the base of the meal, but we're also going to throw in some beautiful green beans, and I'm also going to be toasting some hazelnuts as well. There's good quality fats in, the ones that you talk about. We'll do that at the start, and then I'll chop them up roughly afterwards. And we're going to be you use dukkha, which is that Egyptian sort of spice blend with coriander seeds. We don't actually have that over here, very popular, but za'atar I think is a good sort of alternative. It's got sesame seeds and a whole bunch of other things. And I've already pre-cooked some black-eyed peas here. You can get these in cans and sort of like Tetra Packs as well. Just drain them, rinse them, and good to go. But I actually prefer cooking them from scratch because you've got a little bit more texture and stuff. So,
I agree.
So, whilst I'm toasting these, tell me about how you got into this, because you didn't go straight into research.
No.
Did you?
I had a very a misspent youth, and came at this from a very circuitous pathway. So my first degree was in fine art. I was an artist, and that was way back in the 80s. And then, because of my personal experience, I guess, of what we call common mental disorders, so that's depression and anxiety, I was very interested in psychology, and I went back to university in my 30s to study psychology. And as I was studying, I sort of increasingly realised that I wasn't that interested in being a counsellor, you know, a clinician, but I was very interested in research and in statistics because I'm a big nerd. And so I started, you know, when I was doing my undergrad, I sort of did some interning and then some paid work as a research assistant in a new little research lab that had been set up. And from there, I you know, finished my degree, did my honours in looking at depression and osteoporosis, and you know, using epidemiology. So epidemiology is when you collect lots of data from people and you use statistics to put it together. You don't do any experiments though. And while I'm doing this, I'm sort of learning about this whole field of psychiatric research. And I'd always been really passionate about food and always had this, you know, belief that food is sort of fundamental to health. And certainly in the wider area of medicine, of course, we've known for a very long time that what you eat is really important to your risk for chronic diseases.
Was that sort of influenced by your background? Because I remember reading the book that your parents were naturopaths.
That's exactly right. So in that sense, yes, because they had a real interest in diet and nutrition. But in another way, there was a lot of what they said and did that was at odds with sort of evidence and good science. Yeah. And as I trained, I realised just how divergent they could be.
It's like my parents, and that I grew up in an Indian household, and Ayurveda features quite a bit.
Oh yeah.
There are good parts, and there are things that are at odds with what I believe.
I think with naturopathy, it often can prompt, you know, hypothesis testing, and it's a good starting point for research. But it's certainly, there's a lot that is over extrapolated, simple solutions to complex problems, and we always know that that's incorrect. And I was just fascinated to realise that in psychiatry there really wasn't this body of research that had looked at the role of diet and nutrition in mental and brain health. And it was around that time that there was increasing focus on this field of research and science called psychoneuroimmunology. So this is really about how your immune system influences your mental health. And vice versa, how your mental health influences your immune system. And it was really putting paid to this idea that your mind and your body were separate. And we were really starting to get the point that, you know, we're one highly complex, fully integrated system. So the old ways in which psychiatry was viewed as just everything happening in the brain and in the head was not being supported by the new evidence. But also at that time, there was a lot of neuroscience coming out of the US looking at how we might influence what we call brain plasticity using diet and exercise.
So this is fairly new as well, the sort of knowledge that our brain is fairly plastic, or it maintains its plasticity rather than being static after infancy. When I
was growing up, the wisdom was that you had a set of brain cells that you were born with, and you only lost them over time. And then I think in about the sort of late 1990s, neuroscientists recognised that there was at least 2 areas of the brain that puts on new brain cells all the time. And in doing so, that supports the function of that particular area of the brain. So the area that we're particularly interested in is something called the hippocampus, which is there's 2 little structures side by side in the middle of your brain.
Sea monster.
Yeah, that's right. And they're really, really important for learning and memory. And this is not just in old age, but you know, right from the start of life. But we also know that that area of the brain is involved in mental health as well. And the neuroscience studies in animals were showing that if you modify diet, so for example, if you gave animals omega-3 fatty acids from fish, you would increase this neuroplasticity. If you gave them Western junk food type diets, you'd reduce it, and that would have an impact on learning and memory in the animals. And we actually showed in 2015 that relationship really existed in humans as well. So we had data from older adults, and we looked at their hippocampal volume and their diet and all sorts of other factors, including depression, and showed that there was this very clear dose-response relationship. So people who had better diets had larger hippocampi. And that's now been shown in 2 further studies with much larger sample sizes. So what's true in animals is probably true in humans. But that hadn't made its way to influencing scientists to look at the link between diet and nutrition and mental health. So I set out to do that for my PhD.
So that was in 2005?
Yeah, I started my PhD in 2005.
And you were specifically looking at women's health
That's right, because I was part of a big I was in a unit that conducted a big epidemiological study, and at that time they were collecting data from the female part of the sample. These were women from their 20s right through to their 90s, very representative of the Australian population. We had really good data on their, diet, exercise, and physical health, medical conditions, all of those sorts of things. But then we also did structured clinical psychiatric assessments on them to look at their current and past mental health. And we had a particular focus on what's called the common mental disorders, and that's depression and anxiety. And they really account for the largest burden of disability. So globally, mental disorders account for the largest burden of disability, and of that, depression in particular makes up a huge chunk. It's always in the top 5 causes of disability.
Yeah, because I remember you mentioned that in your book. You have a whole section on the GBD, the global burden of disease, and actually how, traditionally we've thought to think of cardiovascular disease and stroke and dementia, all these different things, but mental health is right up there.
Yeah, that's exactly
right. It's the most common cause of
it's the largest burden. It accounts for the largest burden because it stops people working, it stops people participating fully in life. It can really have a crippling effect on individuals, on families, on communities, and certainly on society. I mean, it costs business $10 billion a year in Australia. It costs the government untold amounts of money in medical care and those sorts of things. And what I think is really key is that if someone has depression, they're much more likely to also develop chronic disease like cardiovascular disease. And those chronic diseases in turn increase the risk of depression.
Absolutely.
So there was more reasons to think that nutrition was important, because nutrition feeds into and is very important for immune function and what we call inflammation, this chronic low-grade activation of the immune system. And that was increasingly understood to be the driver of so many chronic diseases, but also depression. So I set out to investigate this in this big sample, and 4 long years later I did all my analyses and found that my hypotheses were pretty much supported. So women who had healthier diets were less likely to have clinical depressive and anxiety disorders, and then separately, independently, which is a really important point, women whose diets were higher in junk and processed foods were more likely. And that was, of course, taking into account all the things that we should consider, like education and income and body weight and other health behaviours and those sorts of things. And because it was novel and because we had very good quality questionnaires and things, that study, my PhD, ended up being published on the front cover of the American Journal of Psychiatry, which was really cool. And it had a big impact. But what it allowed me to do then was to go and do a lot more work in this area in a pretty short space of time, because there are so many studies around the world where they collected data on diet and also on mental health, but they hadn't put them together. So I jumped around and did those analyses and published lots and lots of papers, and
That's fantastic. Just to quickly go back to this recipe, because I know there's probably a lot of people listening to what on earth is going on right now. So I've just put some half a red onion sliced into a little bit of extra virgin olive oil on a low to medium heat, added some of the sliced shiitake mushrooms, a little bit of the portobello, sauteed for another couple of minutes, and just gone in with the green beans as well. And that will probably take another 2 or 3 minutes or so. And as you can tell, it's quite relaxing. This is kind of how I like to cook at home. What do you tend to eat at home?
This sort of food?
Really? Yeah.
I eat a lot of beans and legumes, I pretty much...
Did you grow up a vegetarian?
Yeah, that's right, And I did eat a bit of meat, in my younger days, but then, I don't know, I don't eat. I occasionally eat a bit of meat, but not very much. And that's mainly for environmental and ethical reasons. But I just love peasant food. So I love beans and vegetables and big crusty bread.
Exactly. And you had some interesting things to say about meat consumption as well in relationship to mental health, right? Because your hypothesis, I think, initially was, a vegetarian diet, plant-based, probably going to be healthier than that. That includes a little bit of red meat, but you came across something else from.
Yeah, that's right. So as a vegetarian, I sort of thought that people who ate meat would be worse off in terms of their mental health. But when I actually looked at the literature, I saw that there were many studies that suggested that vegetarians had worse mental health. Now, we don't know that that's a causal relationship.
Yeah.
We don't know what's influencing what, or there could be third factors that are influencing both.
Absolutely.
So you have to be really careful about that. But when I did my analyses and I looked at meat consumption, I saw this really interesting pattern of association that I just hadn't expected at all. And I looked at it in more detail, and basically what I did is these, roughly 1,000 women, I separated them into, first of all I took out about 20 people who said that they were vegetarians, who didn't eat any meat. And then here we're just talking about red meat, not processed meat, not ham and bacon, sausages and stuff, but just lean beef and lamb.
Yeah.
So looking at this the Australian Dietary Guidelines, it says that people should consume between 3 and 4 small palm-sized servings of unprocessed red meat a week. So we sort of divided women into those categories, those that did eat that, those that ate less than that, those that ate more than that. And then we took into account their overall diet quality, because of course if people are eating, for example, lots of meat, they might also be eating lots of sausages and chips.
Yeah.
Or they might be eating lots of veggies and beans.
Exactly,
and
yeah.
like
No two meat eaters are the same, right?
That's right. So we had to sort of take that into account. And what we found was this almost perfect U-shaped relationship.
Yeah.
So women who did consume that recommended intake of red meat were only half as likely to have a clinical depressive disorder, a clinical anxiety disorder. The pattern was there for bipolar disorder, and even psychological symptoms. And it was so striking and so consistent that we went, well, you can't do a clinical trial on this. You can't take a big bunch of people and say, right, you eat meat, you don't eat meat. We're just going to follow you for the next 10 years and see if you get depressed. So that's why our SMILES trial, the diet that we recommended, was sort of based on a Mediterranean diet, which is this sort of food, but it did also have that recommendation.
What's called the MODI diet?
The MODI Med diet, yeah. One of my PhD students is a clinical dietitian, and she designed that diet.
Right, okay. Just to quickly go back to the recipe.
Yeah.
So
smells amazing.
We've just gone in with the pre-cooked black-eyed peas. I've chopped up the toasted hazelnuts, that's on the board, and then we've just gone in with 2 teaspoons of the za'atar mix. You can get some really good za'atar blends these days. And actually, I remember when I was living in Australia, because I used to live in Manly in Sydney. I was doing emergency medicine there for 2 years. There's like a real focus on local Aussie food, and you guys are so lucky because you can grow so many different things across that beautiful landscape. Yeah. You
should see my backyard.
Oh, really?
Veggie patch, I just put it in the last 12 months, I think.
Oh, amazing.
So many different sorts of greens, because I eat so many greens, and so many herbs, because I just, can go out there and grab a bunch and chuck it in.
Yeah.
But I mean, even when I lived in apartments, I always grew herbs in pots, because they're just fantastic. And so interesting how many compounds are in herbs. Like there's new ways of actually analysing plants and looking at all of the just hundreds of different compounds, even that differ from like the roots to the tips, and all of those interact with all what's going on in your body and your gut microbiome and everything. So the more diversity you can get, the better. So I like to have lots and lots of greens. But I can't grow much else. I'm not much of a gardener.
No, I'm not particularly green-fingered myself, and that's why I tend to stick to just like plant pots and stuff that I can grow in my flat and stuff. But it's interesting you say that about the different sort of phytochemicals that you find in herbs and spices. It's something I speak about quite a bit in both my books, and in my nutritional medicine masters that I'm currently doing at the University of Surrey. There's the modules on polyphenols, antioxidants, phytoprotectants are absolutely fascinating. Yeah. And it resonates quite a bit with what you were talking about in your pod about, in your book about association studies, causation studies, animal studies, and human trials. It's so difficult to be able to do this with a dietary intervention, such as what you did in the SMILES trial. Yeah. And also there's a lot of skepticism as well. You actually mentioned that when you described the SMILES trial, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's justified from a purely scientific perspective. It's not, when you're doing human research, particularly nutrition or lifestyle medicine research, you can't blind people to the condition they're in. We couldn't have one group that we put on a junk food diet and another on a healthy diet.
They're going to know. They're like, wait a minute.
You can't tell you can make a placebo. If you've got an animal study, you can tightly control what they're eating, but you can't do that with humans. So you always have to be aware that there's the possibility that people's expectation of benefit was what led to the reduction. Yeah. But what we saw with our trial and then with the Healthy Med trial, which was a larger study in a group-based setting and that came after ours, was there was a very tight relationship between the degree to which people changed their diet and the degree to which they experienced a benefit.
Yeah.
So people whose diet really improved, they got the most benefit from the intervention. And I think what's particularly compelling to my mind is that we did, for our SMILES trial, and then Healthy Med did it as well, very detailed economic evaluations using health economists. And we
I was
showed
particularly fascinated
I
with that,
thought that was so amazing.
Because that's something I get challenged about quite a bit in clinical practice, like healthy eating is expensive. And you can understand why people might say that, because when you go in the grocery aisles and you go to like the health food section, they're looking at the most expensive sorts of berries and goji berries and all this kind of stuff. But that's not what healthy eating is, and I was so pleased that you did that.
Well, we did two things. We did a detailed cost analysis of the diet that we were advocating people should consume, and that's where we found that our diet that we were advocating is actually cheaper than the junk food diet that people were eating when they came into the study.
Yeah.
But then we did an economic evaluation, and what that does is it looks, and it's a bit, dry and nerdy, but it looks at whether, if you were to adopt this, at the level of the NHS or Medicare or whatever, would it be cost effective? What's the cost of delivering the diet? What's the cost of a dietitian? What's the cost, and what do you get for that? What do you save? And what it showed with the SMILES trial was there was roughly a $3,000 per participant saving for those who are in the dietary condition, because they lost less time out of role and they saw other health professionals less often. And this just speaks to this point that if you have someone with depression, and it's so incredibly common, they're at increased risk for all of these other comorbid diseases. Now, there's biological reasons for that as well as behavioural reasons. If you take a diet and exercise approach to treatment, you benefit the whole person.
Yeah.
Everything improves.
Yeah.
And of course, then they see doctors less often. They go to the, whatever practitioner they're going to.
Absolutely, yeah.
They're
whether
feeling
it's a
better.
nurse or whether it's, an allied health professional, they're feeling better. So, yeah.
And this is why we think it's not just an artefact of people's expectation. The other thing too was that we found it incredibly difficult to recruit. And I think that's because people were really sceptical that this would actually help.
Yeah, you mentioned that as well, right? Like the medical fraternity were quite sceptical about this, and that's why even over that 3-year period it was
67 people, 3.5 years, and it was really, really tough. But also the people with depression, I think, didn't think that it would help.
Yeah, right.
So we really struggled to get people to come along.
Yeah, because I remember actually reading that, and I thought maybe it might have been the opposite. I would have thought if I was in their shoes, I would have wanted the diet and the counselling, but that people had an expectation that the counselling was what the treatment effect was, right? As in
well, possibly. So what we said to them was, look, the social support, it's called a befriending protocol, and it's often used in psychotherapy trials as a control condition. Because we know that when you go and talk to a practitioner, whoever they are, even a hairdresser, you get a benefit from just that social interaction. So you have to control for that, because that's what you get when you see a dietitian. Yeah. But it also is beneficial in its own way. But people, I think, who did come into the trial were much more willing to be in the dietary group. So that's a problem. So what we really need is studies where you have two different dietary interventions that people are happy to go into either one. And that's tricky because there's nothing to say that one form of a healthy diet is any better than another form of a healthy diet. Yeah. So it's very challenging from a methodological perspective. But the fact that people experience so much benefit and that there was such a tight link between how much they changed their diet and how much they improved suggests to me that there's something really powerful in this.
Absolutely, and we're not talking about mild depression, even though that's a very
moderate to quite severe.
Moderate to severe, and then some people, some of the patients actually went into remission as well.
Well, more than 30% of those in the dietary group went into remission, compared to about 8% in the social support condition.
Go back to the recipe. I've just finished. So just finished it off with the hazelnuts, a little bit of the Greek basil, and we've plastered on some hummus onto some sourdough that I've just toasted. And this is for you. I don't know if you can describe it.
It smells amazing, but this is like my favourite food. This is heaven, my happy place.
Good. I'm glad. I'm going to get you knife and fork and just dive in. Just give it a taste.
Well, are you going to have some too?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, this is not all for you. Don't worry. We're just going to video you eating on your own. We'll take a break. And if you want to see the rest or listen to the rest of our conversation, it will be on the podcast, The Doctor's Kitchen. And good. I'm glad.
It's so good. Maybe I can eat both of them.
Yeah. You'll be able to listen to it, the rest of it on the Doctor's Kitchen podcast, and the link will be down below.